Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business here at Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bevington.
Jan, we're heading down to London today. Unfortunately not in person, we're just doing it remotely.
Well, why are we going to London and who are we going to talk to?
Well, today we're joined by Ben Harrison, and Ben is the director of the Work Foundation think tank, which is a part of Lancaster University. He's been in that role since February 2020. And I don't think anything really important happened just after that, so there'll be nothing that's changed in his role immediately after him taking it up. And Ben is a labour market and economic development specialist, and under his leadership, the Work Foundation has developed the UK Insecure Work Index. Hello, Ben.
Hello, folks.
And I'm really, really pleased that you're able to come and have a chat with us, Ben. And in particular, decent work is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so our listeners will not be surprised to realise we're going to talk about some social things as well, because sustainability is so much greater than purely environmental matters. And decent work underpins so many of the human development goals that we're trying to pursue. Zero hunger, good health, quality education. And I'm really pleased as well that the Work Foundation is on our podcast, because we're kind of sister centres and we do some really good work together, and I really value the work of the Work Foundation. So that might be a good time to say, well, what is the Work Foundation from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And we very much appreciate working with the Pentland Centre as well, Jan. But yeah, the Work Foundation actually has a long and storied history which stretches back over 100 years now, and was originally born out of the industrial society at the beginning of the 20th century, really all geared around understanding industrial change and the impacts that was having on people and on communities, campaigning for more just terms and conditions for workers. And as you might expect with an organisation with that length of history, it has evolved and changed over time. It became the Work Foundation, as you might recognise it today, around the turn of the 21st century. Spent the next decade as an independent think tank, looking at kind of big ideas shaping the world of work, as well as providing various kinds of training and resources for organisations themselves. And we've been part of Lancaster University since 2010. And during that period, we've really sought to work with academic colleagues across the institution within our research, but have remained focused on how we can make a kind of positive contribution to the UK labour market through our research, through engaging with employers themselves. And since I came on board in 2020, where we've really been focusing our efforts and our energy is on understanding how structural inequalities and structural barriers across the labour market impact different kinds of people and different kinds of communities. And as you've already introduced, really, with a particular focus on this notion of job insecurity and the kind of wider impacts that's having, how it manifests, in which sectors is it most prevalent, and what might we do about it. And I think that's the other thing I would say by way of introduction. We're really focused on developing practical and policy solutions to some of the challenges that we see. And so all of our research is designed to be used both by policymakers in Westminster, by policymakers across the country, but also by employers themselves. So we try and encourage and support best practice within organisations too. And of course, we work with lots of other people to do that. We work with yourself in the Pentland Centre, we work with other academics across the institution, we work with organisations outside of Lancaster as well.
How do you sit broadly then, Ben, within the Lancaster University community? Something like the Pentland Centre is actually sat here physically, you're sat there in London, but you're still a big part of it.
Yeah, that's right. So we sit within the management school within Lancaster, which is great because there's lots of synergies between different parts of the management school, particularly when we're thinking about that piece which faces into employers and around, aspects of management which have a really big impact on the kinds of outcomes that employees themselves can see. But we also work with other faculties across the institution. We've got various live projects with colleagues in the Faculty of Health and Medicine at the moment, particularly looking at the kind of interrelationship between work and health, a key policy issue in the UK right now, and also the countries across the world. But you're right, Paul, we sit in London. Unfortunately, despite my best efforts in previous roles and those of my colleagues, the UK is unbelievably centralised politically, more centralised than almost any other country in the Western world. I think when other organisations have looked at this, perhaps only Albania is more centralised politically than the UK, and that's despite devolution deals and the introduction of mayors and what have you. So for us to have a kind of policy impact, even in a more remote and hybrid world, it is in some ways regrettably necessary, or certainly advantageous, for us to be based primarily in London.
So Ben, tell us a little bit about yourself then. That's a bit about the Work Foundation and how it sits within Lancaster. What about you? How did you come to be at the Work Foundation? A little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I've spent sort of the best part of the last 20 years working in policy roles, and with a particular sort of focus on economic development, the labour market, the way in which the world of work is changing. So I started my career at the Institute for Public Policy Research in the mid-noughties, which at the time was the sort of New Labour's favourite think tank. So it was quite an exciting place to be, because a lot of the research, we were an independent research institute, but nevertheless we had very good links into the Labour government at that time, and so spent a couple of years there, taking on similar roles within the private sector. So I spent a couple of years at PricewaterhouseCoopers as well, looking particularly at economic development across different regions in the UK. Moved back into more think tank kind of spaces by setting up the organisation called Future of London, which was all about trying to understand and sort of extend prosperity across deprived London boroughs, often through physical regeneration, but also kind of tying into that economic development piece as well. And then spent nearly 5 years at the Centre for Cities, which is a think tank which focuses on the role in which urban areas play within the UK economy. And pegging back to that story around centralisation, one of the kind of defining features of the UK economy is that it is very centralised, not just politically, but economically as well. And the UK's biggest cities actually underperform compared to other places around the world. That actually then directly ties into some of the things that you see in the world of work, because the quality of jobs available in different places sort of reflects that as well, and that has a really big impact on living standards and outcomes for people across the country. So those are the kind of main sort of staging posts, I suppose, on my way to get to the Work Foundation. I've long admired the work of the Work Foundation. They were, contributing, enormously over the course of the last 10, 15 years in particular to various policy angles. But I suppose the other thing which really appealed to me in coming into the role when I did is actually the fact that it has that connection to Lancaster. So it has a kind of geographic base outside of London. How that then can connect into the academic community within the institution, but also the kind of, the extent to which the university can have a civic impact within Lancashire and the broader Northwest, I think is really, really interesting. And that's certainly something which we've sought to try and develop and build out further in the work that we've done over the last 4 years.
That's great. Now I want to move to thinking about the work in particular, and what is secure, rewarding and high quality work, what enables it, and also what undermines it. And a word that you used in the introduction, which I think will come back in here, well, the word you used was structural. So it's not about somebody being a good actor or a bad actor, although there are good and bad actors out there, but actually this realisation of decent work is also a structural question as well. So what is decent work, secure work, rewarding, high quality work?
The best way of answering that is there's a number of sort of key features, I think, which go into making that up. How it ends up looking or manifesting will obviously vary depending on one's own personal circumstances or the sector that you might be working in or what have you. But I think the kind of the features that I would point to are that it pays a decent wage that can support a good standard of living, that it offers a predictability of that pay so that employees within work can understand how much they're likely to earn, when they're likely to be at work, that they can kind of financially plan off the back of that. The opposite of that, the kind of instability around hours or uncertainty around hours, is a big driver of precarity, where if you can't plan for the future, then that puts you in a very challenging place indeed. And then I think there are other sort of aspects which are about the nature of the work itself and your sort of relationship with your manager, with the sort of the broader organisation. That there are opportunities for you to progress within work and develop your skills, which will enable you then to build a career for yourself or a working life beyond just the kind of set of tasks that you're employed to do in that day. So there's something about that relationship with the employer. It isn't merely transactional, but actually there is something in there where you're able to grow and develop and build through the work that you do. Really, really important in the context of security, because that then means that you'll be better equipped to ride out any bumps in the road or storms in the economy that may occur, and that you won't be, at the most vulnerable end of that when inevitably that sort of thing does happen.
I guess then we want to switch to the opposite end of the scale, because you do work on the UK Insecure Work Index. Having all those characteristics you've listed there, does this mean that something like insecure work means there's no potential for progression or development? You've got poor relationships with your employer, it's just transactional, poor and unpredictable wages. Is it essentially just exactly the opposite of what you've described as being secure work?
It can be, but I think what we've sought to do in the Work Foundation over the last 4 years and in the development of the UK Insecure Work Index is actually try and develop a method which allows us to really understand when those features of insecurity can become particularly harmful for individuals. So some of the characteristics you've just talked about there, Paul, depending on one's own personal circumstances, may not be a problem. It may be the fact that you either have wealth from somewhere else, or you're at a particular part of your life where you're actually looking for a certain kind of working relationship which is more transactional, or which is about ad hoc hours here and there, and that's absolutely fine for you in that moment. So what the index does, which I think is a really valuable contribution, is it starts bringing together some of those indicators and trying to identify, when we see combinations of those things together, when are they most likely to be harmful for the individuals involved, particularly if you find yourself in that position for a long period of time, or if you're in a particular part of your life where actually we know, for example, if you're a young person and you remain in poor quality work or out of work, then actually that can have longer term scarring effects, where your sort of earning capacity over the rest of your life is impacted, or it certainly can be impacted. So it's not just those features and characteristics, it's how they interact with one another and how that then impacts individuals themselves.
You mentioned young people there. Are there therefore particular groups, geographical areas that are affected more by insecure work? Has that been something that has been shown through the Insecure Index that you've come up with?
What you see when you look into the particular worker groups who are more likely to be impacted by what we would term severely insecure work, so where more of those different kinds of insecurity come together, you see that women are significantly more likely to be impacted than men. You see those from ethnic minority backgrounds are significantly more likely to be impacted. Those with long-term health conditions and disabilities, as well as younger workers as well. And I think what that highlights really is there's clearly a relationship here with wider structural inequalities that you see in the labour market. And I think what we would probably say is those instances of insecure work are both probably an expression of those structural inequalities, but they're probably also a driver of them as well.
Taking that definition, how many people are caught in this insecure characterisation, either as an absolute number of people or a proportion of the workforce? And I appreciate that'll be hard to estimate, but I'm sure that you'll have some sense of how big this problem is.
That's right. So in 2023, the period for which we've got the latest data, we estimate around 6.8 million people in the UK are in severely insecure work. So that's about a fifth, just over a fifth of the workforce as a whole. It's a pretty significant proportion. What you see when you look back over the last 20 years is that has remained relatively stable. So the various policy efforts to try and improve the quality of work, improve security for people, have had a relatively marginal impact. And I think what we take from that is actually what we're going to need in the future is more radical interventions to be able to try and really make a kind of material impact on that figure.
I wonder about, Ben, you talk about the fact that recent policies haven't necessarily had any effect on this. Is this something that goes back a long time into history, though? Is there any way of knowing that if insecure work is something that has always been there in what we might call the modern workplace, or if it's been there even back before that historically, or is it something that's really developed in recent years?
It's certainly a feature of work in the UK in the 21st century. And I think it's in part a kind of outcome of some of the changes that we saw in the preceding decades, with the liberalisation of the UK economy, the kind of emphasis on flexibility, which in some respects are sort of defining features and strengths of the UK economy and labour market. I think what we would say, though, is that has then sort of filtered through into levels of insecurity being absorbed by individuals, particularly those who face wider structural inequalities and barriers and challenges within their working lives that are unacceptable and that need to be addressed. And we feel that they can be addressed in a way in which maintains and sort of balances some of those kind of key qualities of the UK economy and labour market. So this does not need to impact the kind of competitiveness of the UK economy as a whole. Actually, it could strengthen it.
Do you think, and I'm asking you to put on almost an economic historian's hat here, Ben, I don't know if you've got one of those in your wardrobe that you can just wear for a moment or two, that back in the old, more developing traditional industrial economy, that maybe insecure work wasn't as much of an issue then, but as economies have developed, this has been a side effect almost, intended or unintended of that. Historically, maybe that wasn't an issue.
It would probably be too far to say it wasn't an issue, full stop. But certainly one of the kind of developments which I think for many people will have had a contributory impact has been the move away from unionisation in various occupations, or in the kind of decline of those occupations that did historically tend to be unionised. So worker voice within organisations is diminished over that period for many people, where actually those institutions would be able to provide security or advocacy on behalf of workers and actually, in a sense, protect those kind of core terms and conditions and ensure rights and access and whatnot was maintained. I think alongside that, it is also fair to say that we've seen the evolution and introduction of new forms of work as well, which are in some senses more just inherently flexible on the one hand, but insecure on the other. And I think that's really the kind of the policy territory we're most interested in, which is how do you get the benefits of flexibility, ensure that it isn't just one-sided flexibility, so it's not just flexibility for the employer to be able to kind of dictate and determine terms and conditions and hours available when it sort of suits the employer. It's two-sided flexibility that works for employees as well as boosting security for those individuals.
It's really fascinating because in my mind, I'm thinking when Ben says unions of people like the miners and the mining unions, and obviously sustainability-wise, mining not great, but sustainability-wise, mining seems to have a better aspect when it comes to good work. And this is where you talked earlier, Jan, about the different types of sustainability. There's that kind of thing. Maybe you've got better on one type of sustainability, but got worse on another type of sustainability.
That could be the case, but then also as you're transitioning out of, say, having mining as a big part of your economy, you can do it well or you can do it poorly. And paying attention to people's life experiences, communities, work, etc., particularly when mining was concentrated in very particular places. So I think in that respect, when we're thinking about sustainability transitions, it's not purely saying, well, let's transition and have a better environment, but in that transition you also have to think about livelihoods, people's jobs, etc. You can't separate them. And of course, it does feel like a trade-off, but then the work is about actually bringing it together to make sure that it becomes synergistic. Yeah,
I wasn't necessarily saying that we had to one to get better for the other to get worse. It was just an interesting coincidence in my mind that would be the case.
I would definitely just to come in on that as well. I would caution against, to a degree, probably quite a large degree, sort of eulogising those professions of the past as well. For a good many people, the quality of employment, even if it was relatively secure, the kind of the day-to-day experience of going to work, the impact on individuals' health, their ability to progress in role was significantly constrained. Mm-hmm. So while there may have been more positive aspects in part, I think we shouldn't forget those other aspects as well.
Well, this is the kind of complexity which I'm going to build on, and sorry, Ben, I'm going to layer on a few more things, because one of the things that I found very arresting about what you've said to date is that sort of like that underlying insecurity there for over many years and decades, but also that re-evidences and reconstructs itself. But most of our listeners would have had, two quite big shocks in the last while. The first one is the COVID pandemic, but then also more recently the cost of living crisis. So have those two drivers of insecurity, have they had an impact above and beyond this base, or did they just make the base more evident to people?
The COVID pandemic itself, when you just look at the numbers, would show you that actually insecure work came down during that period, which at first you can think, oh, that's counterintuitive, but it's not really, because it's a result of those people being the most likely to lose their jobs during that period. So we actually saw a kind of contraction of insecure work in the immediate pandemic period. What we're now seeing is kind of return to pre-2020 to 2019 levels of insecurity in the UK labour market, and I suppose it's a kind of critical period at the moment as we sort of observe that, to see whether that trend keeps going and actually exceeds the pre-pandemic period in some way or another. You know, we have a record 1.1 million people now in the UK on a 0 hours contract as their main form of employment. You know, that's just one part of the puzzle, but that is a kind of indicator that these things are kind of on the rise. On the flip side, with the pandemic in particular, it sort of highlighted a number of ways in which work prior to the pandemic was not working that well for people, and has kind of brought a whole host of issues around flexibility, the balance between work and the rest of your life, the kind of other factors that might make accessing a secure job really difficult for you, whether that is caring responsibilities, how you balance childcare with your work, and whether it's the management of a health condition, etc., which in some ways is helpful because it's sort of introduced that into the general discourse of how we think about work and how we design jobs, and what a kind of decent and sustainable set of terms and conditions for people are. I think we're still in that period of seeing the extent to which some of that really sticks or not. You know, those sort of quite early crystal ball gazing forecasts that the world of work was never going to be the same again at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were never going to return to the office, and it was going to be, you know, completely, you know, I think we were all probably a bit skeptical of those, and I think we're now, you know, a few years out from that, beginning to get a sense of, well, which elements of that are going to become constant features of or more consistent features of the world of work going forward. Where else are we kind of reverting back to normal, quote unquote? So I think it's a mixed impact, I think, from the pandemic itself. The final thing I would say back in the more challenging column on that is undoubtedly the pandemic accelerated change and transformation within particular sectors. So if you think particularly around retail, which sort of historically has had a kind of a tendency to have a concentration of more insecure jobs within parts of the retail sector, you saw that kind of acceleration towards more digital and online retail, which sort of changes, even if it doesn't change the overall numbers of jobs in retail, although it certainly can, it changes the nature of those jobs. So we've seen, you know, the loss of in-store jobs on the high street, the creation of many, many more logistics and delivery jobs. That in itself has an impact then on the kind of quality of work that's available within the sector, but it also has an impact on the kinds of people who are more likely to be able to access those jobs or not. For example, in terms of high street retail, those that lost their jobs during that period more likely to be women, particularly women over 50, who would probably be able to take on that kind of job and balance it around either being a grandmother or other, you know, it was relatively close to their home. It was a job that they'd perhaps done for a long time. You can kind of see how that would play out. They're very unlikely in reality to then go and take on one of the new delivery driver jobs, which may be based out of a logistics centre somewhere off, you know, outside of the motorway or whatever it is. So those sorts of changes within sectors themselves, which may have been taking place anyway, but were certainly accelerated through the pandemic, have definitely had an impact on then what the landscape looks like as we're now in the kind of post-pandemic period.
Jan's mentioned there as well, Ben, the cost of living crisis. Have there been changes for employees during the cost of living crisis beyond just COVID impacts, but also in the way maybe that employers are treating their employees and supporting them?
Yeah, so I mean, you're both absolutely right that it's essentially been a kind of period of a dual crisis, really, or certainly one followed very quickly by another, and that has had really significant impacts and pressures on both employees and employers themselves. The really interesting bit of that, or certainly one really interesting bit of that, is that it's brought to the surface a question of what is really the responsibility of the employer when it comes to their workforce's financial well-being, and I suppose especially in times of crisis, but more broadly as well. And I think probably what the experience for a lot of employers was, when the cost of living crisis hit, they didn't necessarily have an established financial well-being strategy for their organisation. You know, there'd be various other personnel-focused plans and strategies which were about the well-being of their workforce, but potentially not one which was specifically looking at financial well-being. And so lots of organizations found themselves needing to quite rapidly understand what the impact of a sudden rise in inflation was going to be for the different parts of their workforce. Remembering, of course, that we've had a kind of unprecedented period of very, very low interest rates in the UK. So quite a sharp change, and I think government clearly making steps to intervene, to provide support both to kind of groups who needed it most, but also to the kind of general population. Employers then thinking, right, well, in between that support, where's our role? What do we need to be doing to ensure that our workforce can also weather this, but needing to do it quite quickly? And I think that's then where the research we've undertaken and in conjunction with yourself, Jan, and colleagues in the Pentland Centre is trying to understand then what do employers themselves think about that? Is this a one-off? Is it a one-off that they should be intervening on, or are they sort of having to intervene because of the failures elsewhere, and they're going to do it, but they don't necessarily see this as a kind of feature of their sort of employment model going forward? Or is it an area where actually they do recognise that employers will have a kind of ongoing role, and what they're going to do is yes, provide short-term support, but also think more strategically over medium to long term as to how that might evolve. And it's been a really mixed picture, as you might expect, across different sectors, across different organisations. Classically, it's a bit easier for larger organisations to think about this. They've got more capacity and resource in-house to do that. A bit harder for SMEs. On the flip side, if you're an SME, you may have a greater understanding of the lives of your workforce because those relationships are just a little bit more intimate and a little bit easier to connect. If you're a very big organisation, from the leadership point of view, you may really struggle to understand exactly how this is impacting different parts of your workforce. So all of that has been in the melting pot, and it's definitely been one of the features of the last couple of years that has sort of driven changes in employer practice.
Is there any alignment, Ben, between companies or sectors that have maybe traditionally had more insecure work and those companies and sectors that have maybe been acting better or worse when it comes to supporting employees within this cost of living crisis? Probably
at the margins, yes. And what I mean by that is if you are a socially minded organisation, if you have, that written into your sort of values and your aims and ambitions, even if you're a private enterprise, but if you have a kind of social purpose and aspect to what you do, then you were probably already engaged in this sort of space. You may not have had a fully developed strategy around financial well-being, but probably your level of engagement with your workforce was probably better and higher than in other kinds of settings, and your ability to kind of activate those changes was probably enhanced. I don't think, though, necessarily there is a sort of a wider correlation about that, because this has hit different organisations in different ways.
Drawing this podcast to a close then, I'm very taken by some of the things that we've spoken about together. The first one is that structural element to insecure work, and that that proportion of a workforce being rather constant over time. And when we spoke about that, you said there needs to be some radical interventions. So you can tell what the question's going to be already, can't you? So where do those radical interventions sit? And in particular, some of them, of course, will be policy, but some of them will be about responsible business as well and responsible employment. So it'd be lovely to sort of get your take on, if you had the magic wand, what kind of direction would you wave it in?
We are overdue an employment bill that could bring employment regulations up to date with what we see in the labour market today. So this has been mooted for, 7 or more years now. The current Conservative administration, albeit under a different leadership, commissioned Matthew Taylor to undertake his review of modern working practices in the UK. Very good piece of work, which had a plethora of recommendations for how to improve and strengthen regulations to support more secure and better paid work across the country. The government at the time essentially said, yes, we adopt those, we accept the recommendations. They had an active good work agenda, and they promised that would translate into an employment bill. Over the course of the last 7 years, obviously the external environment has changed, although we would argue that has made it more important actually to see these things delivered, but it hasn't manifested. We've seen elements of it brought forward, improvements to access to flexible working so that you don't have that kind of waiting period before you can apply. You can apply on day one, but it isn't a right to flexible working. It's only a right to ask for flexible working. That's an interesting example because I think the reality of the power dynamics within some of the most insecure work and the most precarious work in the UK means you may not feel like you're able to ask. Even if in law sort of guarantee is there, the reality is you may feel like, well, I've got no recourse or fallback here. If the first thing that I do upon meeting my new employer is say, by the way, I'd like to discuss flexible working, your fear may very well be that will then put you in a certain perspective for your employer, or you may lose your job there and then they may go somewhere else. So we'd like to see those elements strengthened that have been brought in. There are other aspects of this that we haven't seen movement around. So guaranteed minimum hours, that could see the kind of curbing of the use of 0 hours contracts, we think would be a big step. Getting into, sort of becomes a bit technical, but worker status, so how employees themselves are categorized and the rights and protections that they're then able to access. That gets you into elements of the gig economy and the platform economy. At the moment, those sorts of things are almost entirely being decided in the courts on a sort of case-by-case basis as workers are able to bring those cases into the legal system. That's clearly not appropriate and sustainable over the medium to long term. There needs to be a consolidation of that, if nothing else. But certainly kind of more clarity from government and a kind of strengthening of regulations in that space is going to be really important. So I think those are some of the big steps from a policy side. And I don't think it has to belong to just one political party. As I mentioned, in very recent history, there was a good work agenda from the Conservatives that featured a lot of these aspects. We already know from what they're saying pre-election that the Labour Party intend to kind of take on some of these issues through their New Deal for Workers. So our anticipation is this will be one way or another a feature of the next Parliament, and we think it should be towards the top of the priority list there. The other side of your question was around employer practice, and I think there's a lot that employers can do ahead of those changes coming in. And even within those sectors where we see the highest instances of insecure work. So within the hospitality and tourism sector, for example, we know of reasonably big players, pub chains, others, who've actually moved away from things like 0 hours contracts model. They've engaged with their workforce. They've asked them, would you like more guaranteed hours? Overwhelmingly, very often that comes back with a yes, and they've moved into delivering that. So all of these changes would need to be undertaken with employers, with engagement to employers, but employers themselves can demonstrate leadership, and they can really embed better engagement with their workforce, and they can think about how they can continuously improve the terms and conditions and security that they offer.
Thank you very much, Ben. I think we will draw to a close there. We're almost getting to the stage where we're going to start discussing the potential results of the next general election and things. So let's leave it there and not get too deep into politics.
That's a separate podcast, right?
Yeah,
a whole separate podcast that I'm not involved in, which is just fine. Thanks very much, Ben. That's been a really fascinating and interesting delve into the world of insecure work.
Thank you very much for having me.
What's next,
Jan? What is next? Well, next time we're going to be joined by our colleague Divya Jyoti, and she's going to be talking to us all about issues of modern slavery here in the UK.
And that's going to be really special because we've had some podcasts already on modern slavery topics, and they've always been kind of far away and elsewhere, but here is also an important topic as well.
So until then, if you have any questions, please send us an email to pentlandcentre@lancaster.ac.uk, and we will see you next time. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Babington.